Every human being, no matter how steady they appear on the outside, carries a storm within, a storm of thoughts, doubts, fears, and unfinished conversations that never make it past the mind. You could be surrounded by people, smiling, working, doing all the right things, and still feel like you're barely holding it together inside. And it's not because you're weak. It's because the world never taught you how to protect your mind. We learned how to chase goals, how to work harder, how to survive, but not how to be still, not how to let go, not how to think clearly when everything around us feels urgent, loud, and demanding. But what if the clarity you're searching for isn't something you find out there, but something you uncover within? What if peace isn't the absence of problems, but the presence of perspective? The Stoics believed that true power comes from mastering the self, especially the mind, that our thoughts, if left unchecked, become chains. But if we understand them, they become tools. And today, that's exactly what we're going to do. Clear the clutter, quiet the noise, and help you finally focus not just on what matters, but on what frees you. If you're on a path toward mental clarity, inner strength, and becoming someone unshaken by the chaos of life, consider subscribing for your true self, because the mind you cultivate becomes the life you live. Most people walk through life believing every thought they have is true, that if it appears in their mind, it must mean something deep, something important, something real. But the truth is, your mind is not a courtroom, and your thoughts are not evidence. They are just noise, fragments, echoes of your past, your fears, your experiences. They sound like you because they've been with you so long. They use your voice because they've grown familiar with your patterns. But just because a thought comes dressed in your language doesn't mean it speaks your truth. You are not the thought. You are the one listening, the observer. And once you realize that, even for a second, something powerful happens. You stop being pulled around by every passing mental storm. You stop reacting to every fear as if it were a prophecy. You begin to see the space between stimulus and response. And in that space, something incredible lives: choice. You can choose not to follow the old storylines that only bring pain. You can choose to pause before spiraling. You can choose to not internalize someone else's rejection as your identity. This might sound simple, but it's where real change begins, because without that space, without that quiet awareness, you're trapped in a loop, reacting instead of responding, surviving instead of living. When you no longer confuse your thoughts for yourself, the entire mental battlefield shifts. You begin to observe instead of absorb. And that observation turns down the volume of the noise that's been running your life. Some people spend years trying to fix themselves when the only thing broken was the belief that their thoughts were facts. I'm not good enough. They don't care about me. I'll always be this way. These aren't truths. They're phrases your mind has repeated so often they started to feel like truths. But feelings aren't facts, and thoughts are not identities. You are not the anxiety that shows up in a crowd. You are not the memory that haunts you when you're alone. You are not the fear that whispers when you're about to try something new. You are the one who notices all of these, and in that noticing, you have the power to detach, to step back, to breathe. Carl Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." That single idea can change a life, because it reminds you that you are not defined by your past, not shaped entirely by your trauma, not destined to carry the same pain forever. The thoughts that rise up from those wounds don't have to become the script you live by. They can float in and out, like passing clouds across the sky of your awareness, if you let them. But to do that, you must stop chasing them, stop arguing with them, stop fearing them. You have to learn to watch them, calmly, patiently, without judgment. Because only when you see your thoughts clearly can you respond wisely. It's not about controlling the mind like a machine. It's about observing it like a garden. Some weeds grow on their own, patterns you didn't ask for, beliefs you didn't choose. But once you see them, you can decide whether they belong, and little by little, you begin clearing space for something more intentional. Clarity isn't the absence of thought. It's the recognition that not all thoughts are worth your time. Peace isn't the silence of the mind. It's the discipline to not feed every passing impulse. And that discipline grows with awareness. At first, the noise will scream louder when you stop answering it. That's normal. That's withdrawal from mental habits that have dominated your inner world for years. But with time, silence returns. Not a silence that's empty, but one that's full of you, the real you, the you that isn't defined by every mood, every passing worry, every self-doubt, the you that remains when the storm passes. This isn't something that happens overnight, but even one moment of that space, even 1 second of seeing a thought without being consumed by it, is a victory. It's a crack in the wall, a place where light gets in. And the more often you create that space, the less you live on autopilot. You start catching yourself. You start making conscious decisions instead of emotional reactions. You begin to live your life, not just survive your thoughts. And that shift is everything. Because clarity doesn't come from thinking more. It comes from thinking less and noticing more. It comes from creating space between who you are and what your mind says you are. That space, that separation, is where your power lives. It's where your focus returns. It's where your energy stops being drained by what-if scenarios and starts being directed toward who you're becoming. That's when life begins to feel lighter. Not because the thoughts are gone, but because they no longer own you. So the next time your mind offers you a story that sounds painful, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, is this who I am, or is this just something I've heard so many times I started believing it? And then decide if it deserves your energy. Most of the time it doesn't. Most of the time it's just noise. And now you're learning to hear it without becoming it. That's how clarity starts. Not by erasing the mind, but by rising above the noise. Awareness doesn't begin as some grand awakening. It begins quietly, often in a moment when you catch yourself thinking the same old thought you've thought 1,000 times before. But this time, you notice it. You don't react. You don't follow it down its usual spiral. You simply pause and observe, almost like you're watching someone else's life play across the screen of your mind. And in that subtle shift, something incredible happens. You stop being a participant in the noise and you become a witness. That space between thinking and observing is where awareness is born, not as a loud breakthrough, but as a gentle unfolding. And the more often you practice this, the more you just sit with your mind instead of trying to fix, fight, or flee from it, the more you start to see it for what it is, not a monster to fear, but a messenger to understand. At first, the thoughts still come, the doubts, the fears, the memories. But they hit differently. They don't knock you over like they used to, because you're not inside them anymore. You're next to them, watching, learning, noticing the timing, the triggers, the tone. You begin to see that certain thoughts only show up when you're tired. Others only visit when you're lonely or uncertain. Some belong to old stories you never chose, but you've been carrying them anyway. And suddenly you realize these aren't random. These are patterns, loops, scripts that have been playing for so long they became background noise. And now that you see them clearly, they start to lose their grip. What once felt like truth starts to feel like repetition. The thought that always tells you you're not enough, it no longer hits like a fact. It sounds like an echo, And like all echoes, it only survives if you keep shouting into the same cave. But you don't have to. You don't have to keep responding. Awareness means realizing you don't have to pick up every mental call that rings in your head. You can let it ring. You can let it pass. And in doing so, you weaken the chain that's held you in place. Still, awareness doesn't ask you to fight your thoughts. That's where many people get stuck, thinking that the goal is to silence the mind or erase the thought entirely. But the mind doesn't work like that. It's not about elimination, it's about illumination. What you bring into the light no longer has the same power over you, because when you watch something clearly, without running, without judging, you change your relationship to it. And that shift is the beginning of freedom. When you're unaware, those imagined realities feel urgent and real. Your body tenses, your breath shortens, you react. But when you're aware, you interrupt the cycle. You feel the tension and you trace it back. You question its origin. You realize that the thought you're stuck in today is just a cousin of the thought you had yesterday and the day before. And once you see the pattern, you're no longer inside it. You're standing above it. There's something empowering about realizing that you don't have to believe every thought that crosses your mind. Just because something feels familiar doesn't make it true. Just because a voice inside you says you're not healing fast enough, or doing enough, or being enough, doesn't mean it's right. Sometimes it's just noise from an old chapter that doesn't belong in the new one. And the more you observe without reacting, the more clearly you begin to separate what's actually happening from what your mind is projecting. It takes practice, though. You won't get it right every time. Some thoughts will still pull you in. Some memories will still grab you by the throat. But even in those moments, you can step back afterward and ask, what was really going on there? That question alone, gently asked, without judgment, is awareness. And with enough of those questions, the tangled knots in your mind start to loosen. You begin to recognize the storylines. Here's that fear of failure again. There's the part of me that hates silence. This is the voice that always shows up when I feel abandoned. And slowly, with presence and patience, you teach your mind a new response. Stillness, not the forced kind, not the frozen kind, but the stillness that comes from seeing clearly, from not being dragged around by every mental impulse. Epictetus reminded us, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And that reaction, that space between thought and response, is what awareness gives you. It doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't promise perfect peace, but it gives you the power to choose your next move. And over time, those choices add up. They become a path, a way forward, a way out of the mental fog that once felt endless. So if you've been feeling lost in your own head, if your thoughts feel like too much, too fast, too loud, start here. Not with control, not with resistance, but with attention. Just watch, just notice. Let your awareness do the work that effort never could. Because the mind begins to calm, not when you force it, but when you finally understand it. Some thoughts don't scream, they whisper. They sit quietly at the back of your mind, untouched, unnamed, but always present. You feel them in your chest before you recognize them in your head. You feel them when you're alone, when it's too quiet, when something small triggers something big. These thoughts don't linger because they're too powerful to overcome. They linger because they've never been brought into the light, never written down, never spoken aloud. They grow heavy not because they multiply, but because we carry them in silence. It's not always what we say that weighs us down. Sometimes it's everything we haven't said. And over time, that silence becomes its own kind of prison. We often think that ignoring a thought will make it disappear, but suppressed thoughts don't vanish. They root themselves deeper. They show up in our tension, in our exhaustion, in the way we overreact to things that shouldn't matter. You tell yourself you're just tired, or sensitive, or overwhelmed, but beneath that surface, something unspoken is asking to be heard, and the longer it's ignored, the heavier it becomes. It could be grief you never processed, anger you never admitted, or fear that was never named. You carry it like a secret, but your body remembers. Your nervous system holds it. Your focus scatters because part of your energy is always busy holding that door shut. The truth is, clarity isn't just about thinking positive. It's about being honest, truly honest, with yourself first. There's something transformative about putting the unsaid into words. It doesn't have to be dramatic. You don't need to tell the world. But even whispering it to yourself, in the dark, in your journal, in the car when no one's around, can start to loosen the grip. Naming it is how you begin to reclaim it. You're not defined by what you've buried. You're defined by your willingness to face it. It's strange how we often fear our own truth more than the judgment of others. We keep parts of ourselves hidden, even from ourselves, as if not saying something makes it less real. But silence doesn't protect you. It just postpones the healing. And healing doesn't come from avoiding the storm. It comes from walking through it with open eyes. The Stoics didn't run from discomfort. They stepped into it with clarity and courage. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If it is endurable, then endure it. Stop complaining." But this isn't about suppression. It's about confrontation. It's about realizing that what you refuse to confront owns a piece of you, and you deserve to be whole. Sometimes the most healing thing you can do isn't to fix the thought, but to let it speak, to give it room to breathe. Write it down, even if the words don't make sense. Let the sentence be messy. Let the feeling be incomplete. The act of writing is more than expression. It's excavation. You dig beneath the surface and uncover what's been quietly pulling your strings, what's been shaping your moods, your reactions, your distance from others. And once it's out of you, even just a little, there's room to breathe again. Other times the release comes through conversation. A single sentence shared with someone you trust can break years of inner tension. Not because they fix it for you, but because saying it out loud proves it no longer has to hide. There's a weight that lifts when you hear your own voice speak what your heart's been holding. It doesn't have to be eloquent. It doesn't have to be a speech. It just has to be real. The moment your truth becomes audible, it loses its power to silently hurt you. But even if you're not ready to speak it, you can still face it. Even a breath, a deep, honest breath, where you admit what you're feeling without spinning it into a story, is a step. Sometimes the body can release what the mind is still holding. Grief, anger, guilt, they're not just mental concepts. They live in the breath, in the shoulders, in the gut. And the more you allow space for them to rise and pass through, the lighter you feel. Not because they've vanished, but because you're no longer alone with them. You've met them, you've listened. Aristotle believed that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, but knowing isn't just a mental act. It's emotional, spiritual, energetic. It's learning to sit with the parts of yourself you once ran from and realizing they're not as terrifying as you imagined. They were just waiting for you to stop pretending they weren't there. Unspoken pain isolates. It makes you believe you're the only one struggling, the only one carrying something too heavy to name. But once you bring it into light, even a flicker, you realize how many others are carrying their own unspoken weight, and suddenly your pain connects you. It doesn't isolate you. And in that connection, a new kind of strength is born. A strength rooted in honesty, not performance. There's nothing weak about struggling. There's nothing broken about having something to say, but not knowing how. The struggle only becomes heavier when you convince yourself it needs to stay hidden. It doesn't. You are allowed to speak, to write, to feel, to let the thoughts that never found a voice finally be heard. Because until you do, they will keep whispering in the background, pulling your focus, dulling your clarity. But once you let them out, even imperfectly, they begin to lose their shape. What once felt like a storm becomes a passing cloud. What once felt like a wall becomes a doorway. And on the other side of that door, there is light. Not perfect peace, but space, breath, possibility, and most importantly, the freedom to move forward. There's a kind of pain that doesn't shout. It lingers, quiet and persistent. It's the ache of moments that should have ended long ago, but still live in your mind like they happened yesterday. You find yourself replaying the same conversations, the same mistakes, the same losses. Not because they deserve that space, but because part of you is still trying to rewrite them. You think if you revisit it just one more time, maybe you'll understand. Maybe you'll feel differently. Maybe it'll hurt less. But it doesn't. It never does. Because the past doesn't change. Only your relationship to it can. It's a strange thing we do, reopening old wounds as if we might find peace hidden somewhere inside them. But what we often find isn't healing. It's erosion. Every time we relive a painful moment, we tear it open again, hoping it will give us something new. It won't. The moment has already happened. The words were already said. The silence already fell. What remains is just the echo, and echoes can't harm you unless you mistake them for the present, unless you start living in response to a noise that no longer exists. You can't build focus in a mind full of ghosts. The brain, incredible as it is, can only hold so much attention at once. When you're constantly pulled back into past regrets, there's little energy left for clarity. You can't be fully present when you're emotionally anchored to something behind you. The irony is, most of the things we fixate on can't be changed, and yet they consume us. They blur the present. They make it hard to see what's right in front of us. You're not really stuck because of what happened. You're stuck because you haven't let go of what never gave you peace. Letting go doesn't mean you pretend it didn't matter. It means you stop giving it the power to define you. You stop trying to harvest new meaning from a season that already passed. You allow the wound to close, not because it wasn't deep, but because you deserve to stop bleeding. And that decision, that choice to release, is often the first real step toward mental freedom. Epictetus said, "People are not disturbed by things, but by the views they take of them." It's not what happened, it's how tightly you continue to grip it that causes the suffering. Sometimes we hold on because we think it protects us, that if we remember the pain, we won't make the same mistake. But memory isn't protection, awareness is. You don't need to carry the full weight of the past to learn from it. You don't need to relive it to honor the lesson. And you definitely don't need to let it run your life from the shadows. Forgiveness, especially of yourself, is not a weakness. It's not a soft option, it's a discipline. It takes strength to say, "I did the best I could with what I knew then, and now I choose to move forward." Forgiveness of others, too, isn't about them deserving it. Some people won't understand the damage they caused. Some will never change. But if you carry their actions like a bag of stones everywhere you go, they still control you. Forgiveness isn't a gift to them. It's a release for you. It's how you tell your mind, you don't have to carry this anymore. You release the echo so you can hear your own voice again, the one buried beneath all the noise. Because clarity can't grow where resentment has rooted itself deep. Some will argue that letting go is just avoidance, but true release isn't denial. It's confrontation without attachment. It's looking at the memory, honoring it, and deciding not to let it consume another hour of your life. It's stepping out of the mental loop that tells you if you keep thinking about it, you'll find something new. You won't. what you'll find is fatigue, paralysis, disconnection from the present, and maybe worst of all, you'll miss the life that's trying to bloom because you're too focused on what already withered. You have to ask yourself, how much longer are you willing to let yesterday ruin today? How much longer will you keep trading your peace for pain that's already been paid? Letting go isn't erasing the past. It's rewriting your relationship with it. It's learning to look back and feel something different, not because the past changed, but because you did. And in that shift, in that inner decision to stop bleeding from the same wound, focus returns, energy returns, life returns. And it's not always a grand moment. Sometimes letting go is subtle. A thought comes up and you breathe instead of engage. A memory resurfaces and you choose to observe it instead of relive it. You start speaking more kindly to yourself. You stop telling the same story over and over. And one day you realize it's not heavy anymore. It's not gone, but it's no longer holding you. So when the mind starts to echo, pause. Recognize it. Remind yourself, this is not the present. This is not your identity. This is just a thought, not a life sentence. You've already walked through the fire. You don't have to keep sitting in the smoke. Let the echo fade and listen to what's here now. The breath, the stillness, the chance to begin again, clear, focused, and free. There's a voice that follows you, not outside but inside. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It sounds like your own thoughts, your own words, your own judgment, and that's what makes it so convincing. It says things like, you're falling behind, you should have done more, you'll never get this right. It tells you to try harder, but never lets you rest. It pushes you forward, but never lets you feel enough. And while it might wear the mask of motivation, underneath it is fear. The fear of being left behind, of being rejected, of not measuring up to some impossible standard you never consciously agreed to. That voice doesn't come from nowhere. It's built from years of comparison, perfectionism, and unmet expectations. It learned its lines from school systems, social media, critical family members, and your own patterns of self-doubt. Over time, it became automatic, so automatic that you stopped questioning it. You just listened, and the more you listened, the more it shaped your choices. You stopped taking risks. You started shrinking. You began to believe that maybe that voice is the real you, but it's not. It's just a script, one that was written without your permission and can be rewritten at any time. The thing is, you don't silence that voice by yelling at it. You don't win by arguing. That only gives it more power, more airtime. You silence it by proving it wrong, not with grand victories, but with small, quiet acts of courage. By showing up on days when everything feels messy, by taking one more step when the voice says you'll fail anyway, by choosing to believe that progress matters more than perfection. Because perfection is a lie the inner critic uses to keep you frozen. If it can convince you that anything less than flawless is failure, it wins. But the moment you choose motion over mastery, you start starving that voice. You don't need to wait for the voice to go away to begin. You begin with it present, and in doing so, you chip away at its authority. Every time you show up despite the fear, despite the doubt, you create evidence, real, lived proof that the voice isn't telling the full story. And the more evidence you gather, the quieter it becomes. Not because it's gone, but because you're no longer giving it your full attention. Your focus shifts. You start listening to a new voice, the one rooted in experience, not fear. That new voice won't be perfect either. It may still hesitate, but it will feel different. It will feel like kindness, like clarity, like you finally have your own back. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, and maybe that's why the inner critic exists, to keep us from doing that." Because once you accept yourself, not just the good, but the flaws, the mess, the unfinished parts, you become unshakable. The critic loses its leverage when there's nothing left to shame. Of course, the voice will still try. It will come back when you're tired, when you're stretched thin, when you fail or fall short. It will say, "See, you never changed, but you'll know better now." You'll know that failure doesn't define you, it informs you. You'll know that one bad day doesn't undo the steps you've taken, and in that knowing, there's peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from trusting yourself, even when things aren't. You don't owe that voice a single explanation. You don't have to justify your pace or your growth to anyone, especially not the version of you that was shaped by fear. What matters is how you show up now. What matters is that you keep choosing to try, to learn, to care, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, because every time you do, you prove something important, that you are not the voice in your head. You are the one who chooses what to do next. Seneca said, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality." And that's what the inner critic does best. It builds imagined fears and dresses them up as truth. But once you see that, once you realize how much of your pain was built on stories that were never real, you begin to reclaim your power. You begin to live, not just survive. You begin to create, speak, try, and grow. Not because the voice disappeared, but because it no longer defines what you do with your day. And that's the point. Not to erase the critic, but to starve it. To stop feeding it your energy, your time, your belief. To create a life where your actions speak louder than the noise. A life where your worth isn't measured by perfection, but by presence, by effort, by intention. The voice may always be there like static in the background, but you don't have to tune in. You can choose what channel you listen to, and that choice, made day after day, becomes your freedom. Not all at once, but steadily, quietly, powerfully. You could sit in the most peaceful place on earth, no traffic, no noise, no deadlines, no demands, and still feel like you're drowning. Because stillness has never been about silence on the outside. It's about silence on the inside. And that's much harder to find. Your surroundings could be calm, but if your mind is racing, if your thoughts are shouting over one another, if you're stuck in the loop of what if and what was, then even the quietest place becomes loud. That's the trap most people fall into. They chase external peace, believing it will calm the storm within. But peace isn't something you stumble across. It's something you practice. Stillness, real stillness, isn't accidental. It's intentional. It doesn't show up when everything is finally perfect. It shows up when you learn to stop needing everything to be perfect in the first place. You don't find it in silence, you create it. You create it by learning how to sit with yourself, not to run, not to distract, not to fix, but to be. And that's where things start to shift. Because when you stop trying to escape your mind, you finally give yourself the chance to understand it. We live in a world that glorifies movement. We've been conditioned to believe that doing more means being more. So when we pause, even briefly, we feel guilty, unproductive, behind. But what if the most valuable thing you could do is nothing at all? Not in the sense of laziness or indifference, but in the sense of presence, real, rooted presence, sitting still, breathing slowly, noticing your thoughts without chasing them. That's not avoidance, that's courage, that's awareness, that's mastery, and it doesn't come easily. The moment you sit in stillness, your mind will try to fill the space. Old memories, tasks left undone, fears you buried long ago, they'll all rise. And that's the point. Stillness is not about avoiding the noise, it's about facing it without flinching. You sit with what shows up, and instead of running, you listen, not to judge, not to react, but to understand. This is the kind of stillness that changes people, the kind that strengthens you from the inside out. Seneca once wrote, "True happiness is to enjoy the present, without anxious dependence upon the future." And it's in stillness that we finally learn what that means. Because when you're still, the future loses its grip. You stop living for tomorrow. You stop reliving yesterday, and you begin to experience the only moment you've ever actually had. This one. The breath you're taking right now, the sensation of being alive without needing to do or fix or prove anything. But it takes practice. You have to return to it daily, not as a task to complete, but as a gift you give yourself. 5 minutes. 10. No music, no scrolling, no stimulation, just breath, just awareness. And in that small window of time, your nervous system begins to reset. Your thoughts begin to slow. You start seeing clearly what stress had made blurry. And over time, that clarity follows you into your life, into your conversations, into your choices. You become less reactive, more present, more centered. Stillness becomes a compass, a quiet reminder that you are not your impulses, that you don't have to answer every thought, that you don't have to rush every moment. When you carry stillness within you, chaos doesn't shake you the same way. You might still face pressure, uncertainty, even loss, but instead of being thrown by it, you respond to it with presence, with patience, with power, because your sense of peace no longer depends on what happens around you. It lives within you. Carl Jung believed that silence is of great help to a man who is in process of discovering something in his soul. And that's what stillness truly is, a mirror, a chance to see yourself without distraction, without noise, without the masks. And what you find there isn't always comfortable, but it's real. And from that realness, growth begins. Most people never give themselves that chance. They fill every empty space with something. They're afraid of boredom, but what they're really afraid of is meeting themselves. Afraid of the questions that might rise, the truths that might surface. But until you face those things, they quietly control you. They live in your decisions, in your relationships, in your distractions. Stillness isn't just peace, it's power, because it brings everything hidden into the light. And when you know yourself deeply, when you've sat in stillness and faced your own mind, the world outside feels less threatening. You become less desperate for noise, less addicted to stimulation, less pulled by every problem, because you've already stood in the center of the storm and learned to breathe. You've built something solid inside, something no one can give you and no one can take away. So give yourself that time. Not someday, not when you've finished everything else, but now. A few moments, a quiet corner, a deep breath. Let your thoughts rise. Let your body relax. Let your mind settle, not by force, but by patience. And in that space, you'll find more than peace. You'll find yourself. Not the version shaped by stress or expectation, but the one that's always been there, waiting to be heard. Stillness is not a luxury, it's a necessity. In a world that never stops moving, stillness is how you remember who you are. And from that memory, you begin to live, not in reaction, but in alignment. Not in noise, but in clarity. Not in fear, but in truth. Your mind doesn't just record what you experience, it builds your reality from it. And the raw material it uses most often isn't truth, it's attention. Whatever you consistently look at, whether it's peace or pain, fear or gratitude, your mind begins to shape itself around it. It doesn't judge what's useful or destructive, it simply adapts. That's the strange power of attention. It's quiet, it's subtle, but it's the architect of your inner world. And once you begin to understand that, you realize that mental clarity doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from looking in the right direction. If you constantly focus on what's broken, what's missing, what's wrong, your mind will become an expert at finding more of it. Not because that's all that exists, but because that's what you've trained it to recognize. The brain is highly responsive. It builds pathways based on repetition. Focus becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. And identity, over time, becomes the filter through which you see every experience. That's why some people always seem lost in their problems. It's not because their life is worse. It's because their attention is trained on what's hurting, but the same mechanism works in your favor too. Shift the focus even slightly toward what's healing, toward what's working, toward small, quiet moments of meaning, and you begin to build new mental roads. You start noticing things you once overlooked, your breath slowing, the kindness in someone's eyes, the small victories you never counted before. This isn't about toxic positivity or pretending life is perfect. It's about choosing what deserves your attention, because not everything does. You don't need to force positive thinking. You don't need to fight the negative. You only need to redirect. Slowly, gently, deliberately. There's a difference, and when you practice that redirection daily, even for a few minutes, you start to reclaim your energy. Because attention is energy, and where it goes, your life begins to follow. You don't need all the answers to take the next step. You just need the courage to begin, exactly as you are, right where you are, because clarity isn't something you wait for, it's something you earn by moving through the fog. Let this be the moment you stop waiting and start becoming. If this spoke to you, there's another video waiting right here that will take you deeper. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal.